we're gonna talk about the existentialist starting today, and just to review a little bit, the I would mark the end of the philosophical quest to find a system of thought that made sense. I would say that Hume put an end to that, and for the reason that well, we've been through it, but no arguments that prove some kind of systematic coverage of the entire universe can be validated through logic, and that was called Hume's fork. If you're going to prove something true, it has to be validated either through what he called relations of ideas or matters of fact, and neither of those can apply to things like the existence of God. And he demonstrated that pretty convincingly, although it wasn't recognized until Kant. And then Kant, which was like a long time, like 20 or 30 years, I think. And then Kant posited that there was a limit to human uh, consciousness, or what humans could state about the world. And that limit he called the world of phenomenon. Uh, and then there's the noumena, which is beyond human consciousness. Uh, it's whatever's causing our consciousness, but we can't perceive it because everything we see is filtered through our what I call our operating system, and the mechanisms of our consciousness that, uh, in Kant's view, were the structures through which we see and perceive everything, and those included space, time, causality, and what he called the transcendental unity of apperception. So consciousness was the main thing to know from Kant is that consciousness was not passive. It was active, and it actively uh, process the information of the senses to create the world that we see with our senses. It wasn't something that we just passive. Everybody before Kant had assumed that whatever came to our eyeballs was what was out there. But as we know now from other research, like, we don't see a lot of things. We don't see. There's a lot of senses we don't have. Like, I think sharks have a sense of electromagnetism, and some bees can see in ultraviolet light, and other critters can see in infrared light. So we know now from other things that Kant didn't know about that, yes, the world that we see has been filtered through our specific consciousness. And so then we have Hegel going, well, if that's the case, if we have a creative as opposed to a passive consciousness. Hello, Anne, you made it.
No, she's late, so I'll have to get off when she comes.
Okay. Well, welcome for now. Uh, anyway, so Hegel says, well, I'm of course condensing this stuff radically, but Hegel says, well, if your consciousness, human consciousness, is kind of creating what we see, well, can't human consciousness change throughout time? Can't it develop? And so he had this idea of the dialectic we always attribute to um, Hegel. There's a dialectic in Plato, but it's a completely different thing. It's just discussion, basically. But the dialectic in Hegel is a process that he sees as uh, structuring history as well as the individual's development. And you go through moments in the dialectic, and each moment, what you do is you come up against the limitations of how you see the world. And at that point, you can either quit and just say, I'm sticking with what I got. Or if you're brave and courageous and you have some passion, you re-examine who you are. What Hegel says is you make yourself an object. You look at yourself and you look at your worldview, and from that, at that point you become alienated from your former self, and you're no longer comfortable with the world you that you live in. because you're in a stage of what he calls mediation. Uh, and in the literature, they often call it thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you're at the antithesis stage where you're not your former self, but then eventually, once you absorb the new information in this stage, you will become reunited and one person again, and then but you'll do it at a different level, at a higher level, so that you're more aware. And I think you can use your own life as an example and see stages you've gone through like that, where you were maybe at sixes and sevens and then re-examined stuff and went through a period where you were confused, and then um, uh, you kind of pulled it together, as it were, and you became a new person. I can, you can frame your life that way. Let's put it that way. You don't have to. Uh, it's, as I said, this is just a framework to understand both your life and history. Okay, so after that, we we went through Marx and Darwin. Those aren't directly pertinent to what we're going to talk about today. The existentialists were a 19th century, not too far away from Hegel, but they were responding to Hegel in a way that was critical. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are the guys we're going to talk about. We'll talk about Nietzsche first and then Kierkegaard. And the response to Hegel was critical from both those guys. They weren't buying it. And so we're first going to cover what I call the bull goose loony of philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche is in bad odor, or was for a long time in bad odor, because this is one of this probably the biggest criminal act. It wasn't legally criminal act that was committed in the history of philosophy, and that is Nietzsche at the end of his life went nuts. And the general consensus, although we can't say for sure, is that Nietzsche had syphilis, and he was in final late stage syphilis for the last 10 years, and he suffered from the dementia that's related to that disease. Well, his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, took it upon herself to manage his writings. And she was a Nazi sympathizer, a racist, an anti-Semite, an Aryan supremacist, and she married a guy like that, and she warped Nietzsche's writings to reflect that point of view. And then his kind of thinking was picked up by a guy named Rosenberg, who became the main philosopher behind the Third Reich. So, as you might imagine, in the 40s, Nietzsche wasn't highly regarded by people, because this was, she had literally taken control of the editing and publishing of his works, and she slanted everything uh, towards her viewpoint of white supremacy and anti-Semitism. But these are very different from what Nietzsche thought himself. And in one of the great ironies of history, I love ironies. I didn't mention the one about Marx, but I'll get back to it. A Jew named Walter Kaufmann resurrected Nietzsche. And in 1950, he published a book about Nietzsche that kind of brought him back into the fold of rationality, and he's not sympathetic at all. If you understand Nietzsche, he's not sympathetic at all to the herd mentality or the racist mentality of the Third Reich. That is just not where he's at. It's hard. You can find the thing about Nietzsche is that he writes often in aphorisms. So it's like the Bible. You can go and find something you want to, if you want to promote a certain kind of idea, you can go find it in Nietzsche someplace. And this is supposedly apocryphal, but Nietzsche sometimes contradicts himself. You could find passages that seem to contradict one another. And when this was pointed out to him, he said, "Well, so much the better." That was his response. Now, I haven't been able to track down an actual source for that, so it may be apocryphal, but it is consistent with, I can see him saying that for sure. So Nietzsche was a sickly guy his whole life, and he had no serious relationship with a woman in his entire life. Uh, and this was also true of Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard had a very interesting, we'll get to that, interesting relationship with a woman. But Marx had a family, of course, but Nietzsche and Kierkegaard didn't have a relationship with a woman. Nietzsche was raised by in a strict Lutheran family, but one of the biographical details about him is his father was a minister, a Lutheran minister, and supposedly the family story was at one point he got furious and went up on a mountaintop and cursed God. And this was a big deal to in the family that this blasphemy occurred. But he died when Nietzsche was young and he was raised by a bunch of women. And then that, in addition to the fact he was kind of an intense guy and not very well, not very healthy, he was in love with a woman named Salome, and that was never came to fruition. So he was just alone. Uh, but a brilliant guy. He was a philologist, and he studied. His expertise was in the area of ancient Greek, so he knew all the Greeks very well. And he that's going to have some influence on how he uh, describes things or how he approaches things. Now, sometimes I describe Nietzsche as a guy, if I don't know if you've ever known a guy like this, but a guy who walks into a bar and immediately assesses who in the bar can kick his ass or may kick his ass. That's what he wants to know first. Is there anybody that would challenge me in here? I liken Nietzsche to a guy who does that intellectually. He surveys the situation and says, tries to find who's the biggest bully around. And of course, he picks Christianity. That is, they're the people with the hammer that are squashing any kind of creative thinking. And he wants to attack Christianity. And we'll get to how he does that. I'm I'll apologize ahead of time for because I'm just going to make kind of a bunch of random points because that's what he does. It's if I were to systematize him, I'd be misrepresenting him. But nevertheless, he has a lot of, I think, very fruitful ideas. I should say that these guys, the existentialists, particularly Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, but also Sartre and Heidegger, uh, these guys are why I studied philosophy because they have all the drama and passion. That's Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are just full of passion and drama, as opposed to say Plato or Aristotle or Aquinas or something like that. They're just drearily going through at great in great detail arguments to see if they're true or not. These guys really don't care. I don't think they care if their arguments are true. However, they're very passionate and very effective, I think you'll find in their criticisms, but they're broad criticisms rather than being specific. Well, that logic doesn't make sense kind of criticisms. This The best characterization of existentialism as a whole is by Sartre, and the quote is "Existence precedes essence." And another phrase is from Heidegger: "We're thrown into the world." And what all of them believe, I think it's fair to say, is that what existence precedes essence means is there is no thing that we're looking for, like the sort of thing Plato was looking for in the forms, or the Christians are looking for in redemption, or understanding the revelations that are given to us in the Bible. Uh, there's nothing out there that we're searching for. What we're doing is recreating, or not recreating, we are creating at every instant of our life the life that we're living and our essence. And our essence isn't determined until the end of our life. It's not something we're out there looking for, like Oprah would say, follow your bliss or something. Well, I'm not sure that's inconsistent, but there's no right path that can be sought and found as far as the existentialists are concerned. Why is that? Because nobody like you has ever existed before in the 13 and a half billion years the universe has existed. Nobody like you, exactly like you, has ever existed before. There are people that have similarities that you might learn something for, and Nietzsche says that you can judge who you are by who your heroes are. If you have a hero, that tells you a lot about what you value in life. But that doesn't mean you can become that hero. What we know in music that if you try to, let's say, I mean, a good example is Stevie Ray Vaughan. Stevie Ray Vaughan copies Albert King. You know, he wouldn't be who he is without copying Albert King. But Stevie Ray Vaughan isn't Albert King, and I would never mistake him for it. He's a guy who's mastered Albert King's licks, but he isn't Albert King, no matter how hard he tries. And this is true throughout music. I don't care how hard you try, you're not going to be that guy. You're not going to be Charlie Parker. You're not going to be Chuck Berry. You're not going to be Albert King. And many people have tried and they study all those guys, but you never become that guy. And so your hero tells you who you wish or who resonates with you, who you want to be, but it doesn't tell you who you are completely. That's something you create every second. And one of my favorite uh, events in all of my teaching of philosophy, I think I may have told this to you before, but I was saying, I was emphasizing this to my students. I was saying, you know, what the existentialists say is that right now, every second of your life, you're making a decision. Like right now, you guys are making a decision to stay in front of this computer screen. You could be doing something else. There's an infinite number of other things you could be doing right now, but you have to take seriously the fact that you're choosing to do this. And when I say take seriously, Kierkegaard says that this is you have to understand and choose things with passion and not just passively live your life and follow a path that's laid out for you. So anyway, one time I was emphasizing, you know, I said to my students, which was not untypical for me to say, I said, you know, you could get up right now, walk out of this class, go to the airport, fly to Brazil, and become a potter. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Anything is possible. You could walk out of the class and go down to the Tenderloin and start shooting junk. Nothing is stopping you from doing that. And that's what the existentialist wants you to realize that you are absolutely free at every moment. So this girl got up and walked out of class. It was so great. She was one of my A students. You know, she wasn't some, lazy bum that was taking it as an excuse. She was going, all right, I'm leaving. And she just got up and walked out. That never happened in 30 years. It only happened one time, and I tipped my hat to her. I thought that was such a great thing. Anyway, so that's what the existential, particularly that particular thing of the immediacy of your decision at every second of your life, it's more of a Kierkegaard thing, but it's not inconsistent at all with Nietzsche. So going back to existence precedes essence, what you're doing every moment of your life is creating your essence. Your essence doesn't exist. It's not something you can find out there. It's something that you, by your choices, create. Um, that's very, very different from everybody we've talked about before, but it's the essence of existentialism. Now, Nietzsche Nietzsche has a bad reputation with his statements about women, and he kind of gets this from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer has some. If you Google Schopenhauer's statements about women, your jaw will drop. His hostility towards women, and Nietzsche does share a little bit of that. Some people attribute it to the fact that he was raised by women. I'm not sure. He doesn't. It's not the biggest thing that he has to say. But there are various things that people hate about Nietzsche, and I just want to bring them up. One, he was a Nazi. I don't think that's true. Two, he hated women. Well, there's some evidence that he wasn't fond of women, particularly, although he was in love with that girl, Salome. Anyway, um, I don't think that's particularly important to him. Also, another word that's also used about Nietzsche, uh, often is nihilist. He was a nihilist. Well, why do people say he was a nihilist? I don't think that at all, by the way. I don't agree with that at all, that he was a nihilist. What is a nihilist anyway? A nihilist that believes there's no meaning? That's not what Nietzsche thinks. He thinks you create your meaning. There's just no meaning out there for you to find. That doesn't mean that life is dire or meaningless or grim or without value. It doesn't mean anything like that. It means that the meaning is not a foregone conclusion. That's what it means. So I don't think any of those things are fair. That he's a white supremacist, or that he hated women, or that he's a not. I don't think the word nihilist is appropriate to use to Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, he was full of thinking life was passionate and full of meaning. So I don't get that. All right. Uh, Let me just make some. I'm going to make some points about Nietzsche, and like I say, it's not necessarily going to add up to something that you can put um, into a system. One of the most famous sayings is that he said that God is dead. I think he said something even worse than that, but I haven't found it. I mean, I'm thinking that he said something along the lines of God is dead and his corpse is rotting in Europe, something like that. And what he meant was that let's see, Mr. and Mrs. Jean-Paul Sartre. Oh, he's now waving me off. Okay, the um, the God is dead thing. Okay, what I think is meant by that is that the representation of God on earth right now is the church, and the church is just a bastion of conformity, and that's also what Kierkegaard thinks, that it's no longer anything except a place to enforce middle class values. You go to church, people care more about whether you're dressed properly than whether you've actually helped the poor in the last 5 minutes. The It's all appearance of conformity and morality. It has nothing to do with uh, the actual teachings of Jesus. And Nietzsche said that there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. That's what Nietzsche says, and this is consistent with the idea that we are all individuals. There's no group. He hated group consciousness of any kind because it fed into mediocrity. And mediocrity, what he says about me about group consciousness, what he calls herd consciousness, it's the substitute of a weak man for strength, is to join a group, to feel like I agree with all these people. So, this is a substitute for power. But you probably heard the statement will to power about that Nietzsche says. Nietzsche thought that was an observation, not something he was preaching, a will to power. He looked at people as being people who desired power, but most people were too lazy and too cowardly to actually seek their own power. And when he's talking about will to power, he's not talking about will to power over others. He's talking about will to power over yourself to maximize your own personal power. Now, going back to God is dead, you can't maximize your personal power by joining a mediocre group that wants to just have you conform to everybody else's values. That's not how you achieve your individuality, which again, you're choosing every second. That's not how you do it. And so the God that's represented by the church is not a real God. He's not godlike. He's mediocre. He's just some kind of sappy enforcer of bourgeois dull values. That's who God is now, how he's represented. That God is the one that Nietzsche says is dead. The God in heaven, I'm sure he doesn't believe in either because he doesn't, there's a reason for that, which I'll get to, but he doesn't believe in God, but he also believes that the representation of God as we see it is pathetic. It's just, come on, that's not living, believing in some kind of pathetic bourgeois a group that you can feel comfortable with. That's not godlike, according to Nietzsche. All right, so uh, the God is dead thing is, of course, listen, Nietzsche's in your face. That's how he writes. His aphorisms are, he's not going to gently present this notion that perhaps we could revise our thinking about the no, God is dead. That's the way he puts it. So anyway, it's not just God, it's God that is dead, though. It's all systems that present to you the meaning of life. Any system like that is dead. So it's not just God, it's also systems. And why are systems dead? Because, according to Nietzsche, you're attracted to a system because, again, because of will to power. You desire to understand, and it gives you a feeling of power when you understand things. And when you don't, you have a feeling of weakness. But that feeling of weakness is something you should pay attention to and fight and not just accept the first thing that comes along that makes you not feel weak. So, any kind of seeking for a system for Nietzsche is seeking for refuge in something simple. This was, I don't know if you guys know the book called Escape from Freedom by Eric Fromm, the psychoanalyst. Uh, Eric Fromm is saying this in his book that we can't stand the idea of being free. It's too terrifying. It gives us vertigo. We don't know where to go next. And Nietzsche wants you to fully accept and confront that. So does Kierkegaard, and not seek refuge in a church or anything like a church that makes you feel like you belong. And because uh, uh, it's not like you don't belong, but thinking you belong to another group is to fool yourself. It's to minimize your individuality and your uniqueness as a human being that has never existed before. That sounds kind of pretentious and weird, but the fact is nobody like you has ever existed before. Every second of your life is different from the consciousness that has been experienced by any other human being in history or right now. Nobody's experiencing what you're experiencing. This is just a fact. It's not something some wild existentialist would say. So seeking Barry, yeah.
Kind of a corollary to that is the joining of one of these groups or one of these systems also absolves you of personal responsibility for the choices you make. It gets it off your shoulders. It reminds me of the Dostoevsky thing about the Grand Inquisitor. That I think it's part. I don't know where that comes from, but another sort of aphorism kind of thing about that. People will do anything to avoid, almost anything to avoid personal responsibility, freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Peter.
It comes from the brothers Karamazov. And toward the end of his life, apparently Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky, but toward the end of his sane life, but only read like one or two minor works. So I'm really curious as to what he would have thought if he had actually read, the brothers Karamazov, which he definitely didn't. What would he have made of someone whose thinking was so much like his own thinking and yet who was a devout Christian and a political conservative?
I think you can, well, we'll get to Christianity and the confluence of Christianity with existentialism when we get to Kierkegaard.
Sure.
But I don't know how to weigh in on that question. It's an interesting question. I don't know what to say about it. But Kierkegaard put Christianity together with existentialism in a pretty convincing isn't the right word because we're not trying to convince anybody of anything, but it's
Profound.
it's deep. And uh, hey, I just wanted to say this. Remember, I was talking about this is really completely tangential, but I just was reminded of it. I was talking about the irony of a Jew resurrecting Nietzsche. We didn't mention this with Marxism, but I think one of the lovely ironies of philosophical history is that Marxism, when we were talking about the values, remember I was saying Marx can't account for values, his values of equality, because he can't find that in his system. And actually, those values come from Christianity and from Kant, two things that Marx completely rejected. So as a result, we have in communist states, Christianity is illegal, and yet they're trying to follow the idea that we're all brothers and should share everything. And in the United States, which is a very Christian country, it's every man for himself. But we don't believe in those communistic Christian sharing, we're all brothers values. I just, this is one of my favorite ironies in all of intellectual history is that. Anyway, back to the subject at hand, Mr. Nietzsche. So uh, we mentioned we were just on the subject of how you join a group to avoid confronting the fact that you're responsible for everything and you're making all of your choices minute by minute in your life and you're creating who you are. That's why you do it. Um, Nietzsche thinks that we all have strong beliefs, and those beliefs can be a source of weakness. And the reason is that for him, untruth is weakness. And so you want to seek out all of the things that you think and you believe in that are not true or can't be validated. Remember going back to Socrates when he said, I don't know a lot of things, but the one thing I know is we want to separate truth from opinion. And so Nietzsche's just reiterating this in his own blowhard way that you what you want to do is not have the courage of your convictions, but the courage to doubt your convictions and to question your convictions. That's what you want to have the courage to do. Anybody could just stick to their guns, but what Nietzsche says is much more difficult is challenging what you believe, and the more strongly you believe it, the more challenging you have to, the more challenges you have to throw at it. That's a Nietzschean kind of thing. And along with that, one of his famous quotes is, "You have to trust your enemies and not your friends." And why is that? It's because your enemies won't lie to you. Every friend has a vested interest in keeping your friendship, especially those closest to you. And they're probably not, well, I've heard, I've heard when Anne has left, but Meredith can weigh in on this. We have at least one on the distaff side here. Uh, I I know one of my best old friends is a woman who taught composition at San Francisco State forever, and she says that among her friends, it's an unspoken rule that you never criticize anybody else's looks. You never say that. You always say how beautiful you look. And now guys don't do that. I'm not going to say, Barry, you look so good today. I'm probably not going to say that. But with women, it's common. And so this is Meredith. Am I mistaken? It's a generalization. Okay, so we know that it's not necessarily universally true. But does that ring true to you?
Yes, yeah, yes.
Okay, good. So the idea
Anne
with
would agree too.
what's that?
Anne would agree
Anne would
too.
agree. And
Yeah.
hey, Laurel did show up after all. And
Well,
damn
I
it, I
had a
can't.
data and safety monitoring board, but the trial's going pretty well, so we were able to do our business in about half an hour or so.
I I had a question for you earlier, but I can't remember what it was. I don't think it was about knot theory though, but it could have been. Um,
It was a math question.
yeah,
What are we talking about today? What have
Nietzsche.
okay, Nietzsche, alrighty.
Uh, so Anyway, so Meredith, getting back to that idea that your friends are going to say nice things to you. Nietzsche says you can't trust your friends. You have to trust your enemies because your enemies don't have any reason to lie to you. They'll just tell you you're ugly, you know. And I don't know, take this with a grain of salt. Nietzsche says everything in very dramatic terms, That's why I liked him when I was a kid. And uh, so but there's some truth to that. Who you should pay attention to. And this is why the wise presidents, you remember Obama used to have people on his staff that didn't agree with him because he wanted to get the whole truth. I suspect Trump never wants to hear anybody disagree with him about anything. And if they do, they'll have to say that you've really seen to the heart of this, but there's one small thing that some idiot might. Anyway, never mind. Let's not talk about that. But the idea is that the wise man listens to the people who are critical of him. Let's put it a little softer than Nietzsche. It doesn't have to be your enemy, but if you want to grow as a person, if you want to be all that you can be, you're going to listen to the people who are critical of you, and you're not going to just be attracted to people who always support you. So that's the sense of what he's saying there. Yeah, Meredith.
Well, I just want to say that from my point of view, as a woman with lots of women friends over the years, there's just never any benefit to telling a friend that she looks like something the cat dragged in, you know? No benefit to that. No one wants to hear it. It's not kind. It's not usually your friends. I find over time that my friends devolve into their essence. And so when I see them, I don't really examine how the hair looks today or anything like that, really, because um, uh, they're no longer a new object for me to evaluate. They're who they are. So
I think most husbands are wise enough not to. Does this dress make me look fat? No, dear, of course it doesn't. You look beautiful. I think most husbands are aware of this too, Meredith, but I'm not sure. I don't think guys even care about it. Does this suit make me look fat? Yeah, it makes you look fat, you turd,
You make
That's
the
what.
suit look fat.
So it's a different dynamic. But anyway, I'm generalizing this to I mean I'm using that as just a kind of silly example to illustrate what Nietzsche's saying about uh, listening to the critics. That's what he wants you to do, and he says that takes courage to do. It's not. Um, it's much easier to just accept the fact that you're cool and you're smart. Uh, okay, now I'm going to go down some of my list of Nietzsche quotes. He actually says, "Love your enemies and hate your friends." This is Nietzsche, in his uh, you should. Here's a quote: "You should cease letting your life be a thoughtless accident," uh, which is what he thinks most people do, I believe. He thinks that, you just follow this path and then you follow that path, and then pretty soon you're 75 years old. That's what he thinks most like life is like, and he thinks you should question that at every stage. Now, Nietzsche had a bit of a system, however, and this is a system that was going to influence Freud. And what he says the soul has two parts. Remember, Plato had said the soul had three parts: the appetitive, the passionate, and the rational. Now, certainly Nietzsche was familiar with Plato. He didn't like Plato, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But it'll follow from what I'm going to explain to you. Um, Nietzsche said there were two parts of the two parts of the soul, the Apollonian and Dionysian. The Apollonian and Dionysian were named after the two gods on Mount Parnassus. The big temple was for Apollo, the secondary temple was for Dionysus. And Dionysus' followers were called the Maenads, and the Maenads were women. And people don't believe me when I say this, but I think you can find it in the Bacchae by what is it, Euripides?
Euripides. Yeah.
Uh, the description of the Maenads. Now the Maenads had their festivals, and the whole point of the Maenads was to be lost in ecstasy and frenzy, and they consider this a heightened reality state or a religious state of frenzy. You can kind of what are the Sufi dancers that do this? It's
Dervishes.
the
Whirling
dervishes.
Dervishes.
So it's a similar kind of thing that we're trying to achieve a higher state of consciousness by um, uh,
No,
devolving in a way into frenzy and chaos. So what we associate with Dionysus is chaos, frenzy, passion, uninhibitedness. And supposedly the Maenads would go up into the mountains and they would uh, have naked orgies, drunken naked orgies, and then they would find small animals and tear them limb from limb and eat them raw. This is what has been reported as the behavior of the Maenads. And these are followers of Dionysus. They're the most famous follower of the cult of Dionysus, these people. Now, Bacchus was also, that's a Roman god of the same type. And it's also Bacchus is associated with getting drunk and being, and who was it? Maybe Hemingway said, "Never trust a man who doesn't drink." Uh, I think that was Hemingway. Anybody correct me on that? Anyway, the idea is that if you're sober, you're going to miss something very spiritual and important. That was the notion behind that. So that's the idea of Dionysus. That's the fundamental idea of Dionysus is chaos and passion and frenzy. Now, uh, Nietzsche thinks of this as the fundamental part of the soul, it's not the bad part of the soul, it's actually the part from which everything else emerges. And he would say all animals have this. I think he would say all animals have this part of the soul. But the human being, instead of having claws or fangs or other weapons, the human being has rationality. And that is our weapon. And the rationality is derived from the will to power, which itself comes from the Dionysian part of the soul. And if you want to survive and be strong as a human being, you have to be rational. That's what your tool is, that's what your weapon is. We can't outrun leopards, we can't outfight bears, but what we can do is outthink them. And so that is our weapon. But it's derived from our will to power, our desire to survive. And that comes from the Dionysian. So the rational part of this is where he differs from Plato. The rational part of the soul is a development or a growth from the passionate part of the soul. Now, Plato wants to say that you need a balance, and the rational part of the soul is what's true, what's in touch with the eternal verities and the truths of the universe. And he demonstrates this with the Meno, as I've mentioned many times. But the forms are rational. The ultimate structure of the universe, both moral and physical, is rational. And it's also, according to Plato, beautiful. And the only part of the soul that's in touch with that is the rational part of the soul, um, not the passionate or the appetitive part of the soul. But Nietzsche thinks Plato has it just upside down. The passionate part of the soul will always rule the rational part of the soul. And there's a little bit of this that we can see in Kant and Hume. Hume says that remember, morality is can't be based on uh, rational analysis. It is based on common sentiment. Hume is in a way, Hume is going to lead the existentialists. I don't think very many people would put them in the same category, but there are the intellectual developments from Hume through Kant, through Hegel, to Nietzsche and the existentialists. Started with Hume's observation, and which Kant agreed with, that if you want to find your happy place, your happiness in life, your most power, you follow the passions. And if you remember, Kant said that rationality is not a good tool to find happiness. To find happiness, it's a matter of good fortune and following your desires. That Kant himself said this. This isn't uh, one of those reckless existentialists. This is Kant saying it, and that comes from Nietzsche's divorcing of rationality from uh, sentiment and morality. So anyway, those are the steps, and then we get to Nietzsche, and so he thinks that Plato is just upside down. The rational part can never rule the passionate part or the appetitive part because it's created by the passionate and appetitive part. Peter.
Yeah, I think something that William Blake said that Nietzsche certainly never read would have really resonated with him. Energy is the only good and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. You know, that's what the Apollonian is. You need it, but all it is the bound or outward circumference of the Dionysian.
Right. So the the result is that Nietzsche thinks. Remember, Hegel said that nothing in life, nothing great is ever achieved without passion, and certainly Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are going to agree with that. And as a result, you may remember and may have been puzzled by the fact that I called Marx a romantic, and I kind of think of the existentialists also as romantics. Now, um, there's a philosopher in the 20th century called Elizabeth Anscombe. Anscombe was a scholar, a famous Wittgenstein scholar who uh, translated some of his works. And I love her assessment of existentialism. She says the existentialists are wet behind the ears. And that's something that I don't think Nietzsche or Kierkegaard would like to hear, but there's some truth in it, I think. And the truth is this, that this seething passion that we see in Nietzsche and we see in also in Kierkegaard, although maybe seething's not the right word for Kierkegaard, um, this emphasis on passion. I think what Anscombe is saying, I don't know. She doesn't elaborate on this. That's just her quote, but I'm going to elaborate on it. She says, I think what she's saying is that that old thing that I think we discussed before, that you must be a romantic at one time in your life, but if you never advance beyond the romantic, then you have limited yourself. And so I think what she's saying is everybody knows this. Everybody knows that, yes, you're free every second of your life. You're creating yourself. Everybody knows that already. Let's get on with the business of figuring out what's true and what's not true. I think that's what Elizabeth Anscombe is saying, because remember, she's from the Wittgensteinian tradition, which is highly empirical in its own way and anti-metaphysical and religious.
Sounds a lot
Anti,
like sarcasm to me.
well, it's definitely sarcasm. It's definitely sarcastic, but it's a shocking thing. It's as shocking to say that about the existentialists as Nietzsche saying God is dead. It's Anscombe kind of coming out of her corral and saying, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, we know all this stuff." And in a way, you can describe all of the existentialists as being something like, "Wake up, you're alive. You can do anything you want to do, and don't be a wuss." Uh, I don't know if that's too perfunctory, but anyway, there's some. I think that's the sense of what she's trying to say. That um, that everybody knows this already. Let me uh, let me see if I've got some other Oh, yeah, we already did that kind of. Um, oh, yes, that's right. Um, so Nietzsche says that the desire to find absolute truth is a desire that uh, Freud's going to call the death wish. You desire peace. You desire everything to stop. And we go back to Goethe, abide moment, thou art so fair. You want that moment of, you want that life of peace where nothing changes, everything's settled. You want that. And so Nietzsche says that's a desire to die, and that's what Freud picks up. That I said I would talk about Freud a little bit. I don't know if it'll be much more than this, but Freud picks that up as well. That Thanatos, Freud's seeking of death. Eros and Thanatos, I think, if I'm not mistaken, are the two drives that Freud describes. Uh, all right, I think you know every I was just thinking about this morning. Every single one of these sessions that we have could be an entire semester. And so this is a survey course. We're just going through and trying to touch the bases on what these guys did and how they influenced the things that came after them. So that's all we can do with Nietzsche. I confess to being a fan of Nietzsche, and if that doesn't set well with you, I guess it won't set well with you. But I'm also even more of a fan of Kierkegaard. I love these guys, and without them, I wouldn't have ever studied philosophy. If I had been introduced to Plato and that was it, or uh, Wittgenstein and that was it, I never would have studied philosophy. That said, those guys are really important. I just didn't have the whatever. I didn't have the background or the experience or the uh, study of philosophy enough. I didn't have enough stuff behind me to recognize Plato and Wittgenstein for what they were. But these guys just hit you in the face right off the bat. Yeah, Meredith.
You said you were going to discuss their disregard for Christianity. Are you going to get any further into that, or was it God is dead? And okay, that's enough.
Well, I did mention that. Okay, I was going to say one more thing about God, but I think I've kind of touched on all these things, but just briefly. First of all, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard agree that um, the God as represented in the contemporary, it would have been Protestant churches of their day, was not godlike. That God was not godlike. They both agreed with that. That and so the further thing in the idea that God is dead is what I mentioned in with the idea that the the desire for eternity or the desire uh, for a final answer, something like that, is anti-life according to Nietzsche. And also, Nietzsche was very opposed to anything that focused your attention away from this life and focused it towards the eternal life because he wanted you to trust your instincts. You're an animal, you're alive, and the things that make you feel good are the things that are true. Now, that can lead to a bunch of nonsense, which it did in the case of Ayn Rand. And, you know, just you should balance it with the fact that Nietzsche also thought, yes, you should follow your instincts, but one of your instincts should be for the truth. And it may be the case that you have to question your instincts, question your druthers and your resonance with some kind of way of thinking, question it uh, to see if it really holds true. And so that would be the Hegelian in Nietzsche that wants you to step back from what you firmly believe and put it in doubt. Your whole life, you should put your whole life in doubt. You're the question, and you live uh, like this comes from Hegel too. you live through the philosophical problems. You don't consider them from afar or in a disinterested way. You live through them. So anyway, going back to your question about God, what I'm not sure what more would you like to hear about that, Meredith?
Well, I was just noting that in my life there have been in various Protestant services and discussions. There's a lot of thinking about what the afterlife will bring, and and making your behavior in this life set you up for a reasonable afterlife.
Right?
And I think that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are saying you're alive now. You have to act on your passions and don't you don't focus on some unknowable afterlife ever. And yet it's discussed a lot, I think. In
I agree that everything you said is correct. Uh, I myself, in thinking about heaven, bear in mind, everything you've heard about heaven is based on human experiences. There's going to be a choir of angels. Well, you've seen a choir. You maybe haven't been angels, but they sing more in tune than any of your choir that you ever heard. I would hate that. I mean, is Albert King going to be in heaven? That's more my style. I mean, what's going to be there? The pictures that I hear about heaven are horrible. They're appalling. So
Well, I
I
have
don't.
to agree because the pictures I've heard about heaven all my days are very boring.
Who sets
And
the rules for getting into heaven is the big issue, right?
well, that's certainly a big one, but I imagine, look, you know that if you have an injury, this is Laurel's field. If you have an injury to the brain, you can have a whole part of your perception of the world go bye-bye. For instance, you could lose your ability to appreciate music. And that's because some damage has occurred to the brain. Now, how much damage occurs to the brain when you actually die and it ceases to function? I would say every sensation is now missing. And so, how do I appreciate a life in heaven without having any ability to perceive anything? I can't imagine. A long time ago, I just decided this is just impossible to imagine. So, how, if everything I imagine it to be good about it to be good would be something like what I've already experienced, but in heaven I'm not going to experience any of those things. So how does this work? I can't figure it out. It's as much that as anything else. But Nietzsche, just as you said, Meredith, Nietzsche wants us to say, "Hey, you're alive right now. Don't put it off. You can't put off things that are happening right now. You can't stop time. What's happening right now, the decisions you make are going to affect not whether you go to heaven or not, but what the next 5 minutes are going to be like, and the next 2 hours are going to be like, and the next year is going to be like. That's what's important. And everything after that is a blank space. Peter.
Yeah, another thing Nietzsche has against Christianity is self-abnegation. You know, that
Yeah.
your own desires are bad. Yourself is, you're basically a sinful child and you have to confess before God. And the curious kind of paradoxical thing is that he admires Jesus greatly. But at one point, Zarathustra says, "Verily, too soon died that preacher whom the preachers of slow death honor. If he had lived longer, he would have changed his mind. He was noble enough to change his mind." So he admired Jesus. He did not like Christianity. He had tremendous admiration for the Old Testament. He did not think any more highly of the Jewish tradition than of the Christian tradition. But there is still that paradox that from his religious upbringing, he retained at least this sense that there is greatness in the Old Testament. And, I think God of Job would have appealed to him, and that Jesus was great but mistaken.
Yeah, you're not going to find a consistent
No,
philosophy in
of course
Nietzsche,
not.
so it's not really surprising. But he's kind of poking you in the ribs and saying, hey, think about this. Hey, think about this. He's not really trying to create because it would go against Nietzsche says that the world, he uses the word fecund. In other words, the world is infinitely fertile and infinitely complex and detailed on many levels, on infinite numbers of levels. And the idea that you could find a system that would explain everything to you is a stupid idea it's for weak people, and it's what it's to give it. The idea is it gives you a false sense of power and understanding and mastery that is not possible. For human beings, it's not possible. Now, you could actually compare this. It's kind of a Christian thing to say. You could compare this to the medieval idea of nominalism, that only God knows the truth of everything. We can't know the truth of everything. Well, I once wrote a paper in graduate school about Heidegger, and I translated all of Heidegger's terminology into biblical terminology. And my professor was very happy with that. It was like, this is Heidegger is Christianity for atheists. And I like that. But th there's a certain aspect of Christianity that could be said to be consistent with what Nietzsche says about the life being. Uh, but, that said, Christianity is full of apologists who will make anything make sense. Barry.
Just going to say that, the invention of confession, and in Catholicism and in Judaism, we have the Day of Atonement. So those are clever inventions for these organizations to develop, because if they weren't able to pardon you and absolve you of your sins at some point in time, you would spend your whole life racked in guilt. Whereas because they can pardon you, and on the interim, whenever you go to confession, or every year if you're a Jew, it gives you further connection to that institution, because you've kind of gotten a preliminary pass for heaven.
Uh, in my cynical moods, I can describe Christianity as one of the great scams. I mean, okay, here's the situation. Every human being, regardless, and even worse if they're not Christian, every human being is born a sinner. What can be done? And so a life of misery and suffering is your that's what's on the plate. How do you escape this? Well, you can't escape it except in heaven. How do you get to heaven? Well, you got to talk to us and probably give us some money too. I mean, it is really a fabulous scam because nobody can escape. There's no escaping original sin. And there's only one path out, and we're going to tell you what it is. You can't get there any other way. You can't do that by getting rich, as is said in the Bible. You can't do it by doing good works. This is the controversy in Christianity between justification by works and justification by faith. Uh, the more traditional view, I think, is justification by faith. That's what Augustine says. In other words, you can't earn your way into heaven, is the point. So there's no way out. You just have to uh, devote yourself to God and hope that God gives you his grace and lets you into heaven. That is a serious scam. I mean, Amway, and I can't think of who's better than that on this. I hope I don't
Hey,
offend, huh?
So,
not Amway. No.
I don't
so
know. Amway's not a good example.
I'm thinking about what Barry said, and you can also apply that maybe to Buddhist meditation and Freudian talk therapy. They all sort of do the same thing in some ways.
All religions and all therapies offer the hope of some kind of resolution of your miseries.
Or self-awareness, maybe. I don't know. Nothing.
And the existentialists don't do that. But that doesn't mean that isn't a negative thing as far as I'm concerned. That you are free to create yourself. You don't have to become reconciled to some system that you didn't create in order to achieve some kind of peace. You don't have to do that. You can create your own peace any way you want to. Well, hopefully not by murder, but you could. I find that liberating. I don't find it oppressive. Let's see what people sound is really breaking. Oh, Anne is suggesting everybody stay mute unless you're speaking. So I'm not sure she's getting some kind of interference from microphones. That's good anyway, because when we do the speaker view that my wife is doing, uh, if anybody makes a noise, the speaker view switches to them instead of who was talking. So like that. Uh, yeah, Meredith.
There's this old saying that life is something brutish and short. And I think that many people are seeking a way out of their own brains and minds. It's into something that will make them feel more comfortable in their skin. And lots of times it's drugs or alcohol, and sometimes it's love or sex, and sometimes it's religion.
I
And
hope you're not suggesting there's something wrong with drugs, alcohol, and sex. Anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted, Meredith.
I think you know what I'm trying to get
Yeah,
at.
yeah, I do. I do. Well, that's exactly right. And
I mean, if I actually spent my whole day trying to create meaning for myself, I would just be totally exhausted.
well, no, but I don't think it's I think you do create meaning for yourself. You do the things that feel meaningful to you. That's what you do. And I used to have this dispute with the other professor at College of Marin who was a nihilist, and life didn't have any meaning. And I told you this, he was a leader and the main writer in a punk rock band. And I said, what if your drummer didn't show up? Would that have any meaning for you? So his life does have meaning. You can't deny that you care about things. I'm sure there's things you care about, Meredith. You don't have to create some gigantic edifice that is meaningful. You just have to look. Kierkegaard wants to say that you just have to know that this is on you. You're making the choices and accept the responsibility for. If your life is meaningless, then you think it's meaningless, then you need to find meaning. That's all. But created every day. Yeah, I don't, my life is just nothing anymore, and it's perfectly fine with me, but it used to have a lot of Sturm und Drang to it. Very.
Just say to Meredith, you can create a lot of meaning by taking a nap sometimes. It's okay.
Yeah, I think that too. Like I said, it to me it's lifting a burden off my shoulders. I don't have to do this or that. I don't have to get rich. I don't have to confess my sins. I don't have to aspire to heaven. I don't have to do anything specific that somebody else has thought up in order to make my life meaningful to myself. That I none of that stuff that's out there. In other words, again, existence precedes essence. None of that stuff that's out there is something that requires my actions.
So Tony, I have a question on this. Nietzsche's, I mean, I apologize for missing the first half, and I'm sure I missed some key stuff, but all of this discussion about your personal life being meaningful, where does community fit into this? Because it seems to me that if you're that discussing your individual life as the focus of meaning is leaving out the fact that you don't exist in a vacuum. You exist as a person among other people, family, friends, the people around you, the larger community, the animals who have fortunately gone off to chase squirrels or something. Um, but there's this whole world around you, and I guess for me to try to find meaning just for me, just centered entirely on myself without recognizing that I don't exist in a vacuum is omitting. Uh, it's not that I feel obliged to be of service all the time or something, but I don't want to have the meaning of my life separated by some sort of icy wall from what is around me. Where does that come in? That you are part of the world and part of a community, whether you like it or not. You live in this place with people in the world.
I actually think I can respond to that. First of all, you're right to say that that was the focus of the existentialists, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre and others, to focus on you as an individual. However, the thing about joining a group or being part of a group that I think if I were Kierkegaard, I would say that, and I don't know if Nietzsche differ, but okay, they're both suspicious of groups in the sense that a group gives you an artificial feeling of belonging when you haven't really earned it. You've just joined a group. You know, you join the Kiwanis Club, and so you're in the Kiwanis Club, and now you're part of that group. That's an artificial feeling of belonging. But if you do it Kierkegaard would say with passion. In other words, you understand that it's you that's choosing. You didn't just fall into it. You didn't actually accidentally become a member of this group. You chose to become a member of the group because that's what gave meaning to your life. That's the difference. Now, you may think that's just uh, mincing words, that it doesn't really mean anything. But the difference is, I think, significant. That you don't just fall into something. Uh, okay, both of you, Laurel, why don't you respond to that because it was your question.
You're mute. Laurel,
Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Okay, that's not exactly my question. Okay, I think one of the problems with American life is that, and this has been um, co-opted by a lot of our political things, is sort of that your self satisfaction in isolation. And I think, Timothy Snyder's new book on freedom talks about that you don't exist in a vacuum. And it's not, quote, joining groups, it's recognizing that you are not separate, that, that, and maybe this is part of passion and part of having a Dionysian senses. You are not you're not existing in a vacuum, and that whatever satisfaction or meaning you have doesn't exist out of the context of being a human being in a world.
There are Christian existentialists, and I don't know exactly what that means, but the idea, Laurel, is at the end you're going to die alone. Every choice you make is making up your own life, and if your own life finds meaning in the society of others and in community, then that's the choice you've made to create your life. I don't think there's anything wrong or mistaken about that. But somebody like Nietzsche or maybe Van Gogh, or you pick your weirdo, that wants to live a solitary life of creativity and passion, there's nothing wrong with that either. The point is being conscious, as it were, of the fact that you're making this up. And you got your hand up.
yeah.
And
So I have 3 points. Sure. First of all, Laurel, yeah, the primary tenet of environmental thinking is exactly what Laurel is saying, is that nobody exists in a vacuum. Nobody exists as a discrete entity. And we exist always in community with human and other than human beings. So I agree with you completely about that. A sense of community is inescapable once we start thinking about the fact that we rely on the other than human world for our existence. Second point is, I think Camus is a really good example of an existentialist who does stress a sense of community and commitment. But the third point is, living in the South, I've come to a new understanding about the role of Christianity, for instance, with regard to slavery and with regard to people whose ancestors were in slavery, and the incredible sense of the incredible importance of Christian churches for people who really actually needed to have something to look forward to that was beyond this life, because this life was offering them so little. So I agree with you about, in general Christianity, but I just have a respect and a sense of understanding for the role that the Christian churches have played among, for instance, African American communities, you know, and that's really different from the sense that I had before I lived in the South.
Uh, I too have sympathy for a lot of the same things that you're talking about, Anne. These guys, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, were in Northern Europe, and I'm sure the churches that they would have attended would have been very rigid and certainly included no black people.
Yeah.
Uh, so those are really excellent points. That they're I don't think that they necessarily negate what Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are saying, though. They're just always calling attention. And in a way, this is how I fashioned my graduate paper about Christianity and existentialism was you can and theologians have made the point that there's no real difference between Nietzsche's idea and Kierkegaard's idea of having the responsibility to create your own life the next second, and the eschatological teaching of Jesus that the kingdom of God is at hand, and that everything you do is right now, everything you do is in the Christian sense being judged for all eternity, and in fact, Kierkegaard says each choice is infinite. So each choice that you make is for all time. It can't be relived. And so there are ways of looking at existential, but existential had to be a correction to a dominant um, culture of conformity that was sanctioned and basically patrolled by the church
Mhm.
in their day. It had to be done. Somebody had to throw a monkey wrench into that operation. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, I agree with what both and Laurel's.
Uh-oh, you froze. Oh no. Oh no.
Can't I be heard? Okay.
Now we'll try again. Oh,
Remember,
I'm afraid you're breaking up, Peter. I'm so sorry.
agree with, and I think the simplest way it's been said is Paul's remark, we are members one of another. What's
I'll put it in chat.
Okay. Okay.
okay?
We'll try to
Oh.
look for it in chat. Uh yeah. These guys are bear in mind I did say they were both loners. They never married. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, although completely different dynamics in both cases. And they are heavily oriented towards the individual, but it's not like what they said uh, doesn't apply to all of us at the
Yeah.
same time. Um, I think they're just issuing a warning that you can't subsume yourself into the herd mentality or the customs of the day. You can't consider that or accept that as the meaning of your life. Or actually, you can, but when you do, you have to realize that's what you're doing. They want you to be conscious. Like I said, the whole thing could be summarized as wake up. Um, let's see. From and everyone, Peter's saying the simplest way to get this sense of community is St. Paul's. Uh, we are members, let's see, of one another. I would say, however, this needs to include non-human beings too. Yeah, so that certainly neither Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, or for that matter, Sartre, Heidegger, or Camus, or well, I don't know about Camus, have anything to say about the natural world and us being a part of that. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, Nietzsche actually does have something to say about the natural world. Zarathustra talks to his animals, and he loves his animals, and they love him. Every time he tries to talk to a human being, except for that very devout hermit he meets in the forest, it's a failure. But he loves the animals, and one thing Zarathustra says is, remain true to the earth and do not believe those who speak to you of super-terrestrial hopes.
Yeah.
Poisoners are they, whether they know it or not. So I actually think Nietzsche has a very strong sense of the earth. He's very isolated from human beings, and I think that's partly his fate. It's not entirely his choice. He was lonely because he had things that he thought about that nobody wanted to hear, least of all to hear from a professor of philology at Basel. And he kept reaching out to people, and he had some good friends, but there was nobody who was all that close to him in the end. Lou
Yeah.
Salomon said a beautiful thing about Nietzsche. She describes him and she
Who,
says,
who, who?
Lou Salome, the woman that
Oh,
he was
Salome.
in
Yeah.
love with briefly in the early 1880s, um, she describes what he looked like, and she says he had eyes that looked inward as if into the distance. And I think she was absolutely right not to want to get married to Nietzsche or have an affair with him, but she really, responded to something very deep and beautiful in him. He's one of my favorite philosophers, and I think you gave a terrific account of him.
Well, thank you. He's also one of my favorites. And like I say, I wouldn't be here, literally wouldn't be here talking to you if it weren't for Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Those are the guys that really appealed to me when I was young, and they still appeal to me. I still have a fondness for them. That I see. These are the guys I love. I told you I don't like Augustine. I don't like the Christians very much because it's not philosophy to, if you already know the answer, you can't call it philosophy, is kind of the way I look at it. Philosophy is more of an existential pursuit in that you try to find the truth as best you can without knowing what the future is. You can't posit what the future, what the outcome is going to be, and that's what all the Christian thinkers do. In my, as philosophers, I'm not saying I don't like Christians. I'm saying as philosophers, I don't like the modality. Um, I listen. This has gone really long today, and wonderfully so. But let's call it a day, and we'll get back to this, and then start on Kierkegaard on next Tuesday. Uh, Another one of my really favorite guys, Søren Kierkegaard. So if there's nothing else, we'll see you on Tuesday.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Tony. It's been
All
a fun
right.
session.
All right. Great.